I used to be his mother, the one who cooked his meals, buried my husband alone in the rain, and wiped his tears when the world abandoned him. Then one day he brought a psychiatrist to my house, to have me locked away and steal the home I spent 40 years paying off. If you think this is just another family drama, you're wrong. Subscribe now so you never miss another chilling revenge story like this one. Under the overcast sky of Willow Creek, Oregon, nestled on a quiet street veined with dogwood trees and brittle old fences, stood the Whitmore house, an aging 2-story structure with ivy-covered brick and windows that blinked memories instead of light. It was a house that had watched generations pass through its creaking halls, a house that had once overflowed with books, laughter, and the smell of fresh lemon pound cake. Now it stood mostly silent, save for the sounds Eleanor Whitmore made as she moved about, slow, careful, and deliberate, like someone trying not to wake ghosts. At 73, Eleanor moved like a woman both deeply rooted and quietly hunted. Her silver hair was always clipped back in a tidy twist. She wore cardigans with elbow patches and sensible shoes. But it was her eyes that betrayed the steel underneath, gray, sharp, and unnervingly alert. Though she lived alone, she was never truly alone. The house carried the ghosts of its own history, and Eleanor remembered every syllable of it. She still kept Howard's chair by the fireplace. Her late husband had been a complicated man, brilliant and distant like a lighthouse that never let you get close. He had died nearly 20 years ago, suddenly on a rainy Thursday night, after a violent argument with their youngest son, Jeremy. The memory clung like mildew. Eleanor hadn't spoken of it in years, but the storm of that night played on repeat in her mind when she walked past the stairwell where it had all unfolded. The shouting, the slamming door, the silence that followed. After Howard's death, Eleanor had poured herself into the only 2 things that made sense: her children and her books. She was a retired librarian, and even in retirement she'd converted the front parlor into a miniature library. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, each book marked with handwritten catalog numbers. Children from the neighborhood used to come by after school to borrow stories. She'd host weekend reading circles, tea afternoons for the mothers. But over time the visits slowed, then stopped. Willow Creek changed. People moved. Children grew. And Eleanor, ever the loyal archivist of time, remained. Her relationship with her children had frayed over the years, especially with her eldest Marcus and middle child Annabeth. They accused her of favoritism, of protecting Jeremy, even when he had lost jobs, lashed out, and let bitterness rot whatever was left between them. After Howard's death, whatever tension had existed in the family quietly calcified into distance. Marcus moved to Denver. Annabeth rarely called. Jeremy, lost and lingering, stayed nearby, hovering like a moth, unsure whether to seek light or burn. It was Jeremy who knocked on the front door one early autumn morning with Cassidy by his side and a hesitant smile. Cassidy was the kind of woman who wore confidence like perfume, thick, noticeable, and just a little bit artificial. She was pretty in that way that made you question if it was genuine. She smiled too quickly, talked too slowly. Eleanor had met her twice before, once at a Christmas gathering 5 years ago, and once at a funeral when Cassidy barely offered a handshake. "We were thinking," Cassidy said, brushing a loose strand of copper hair behind her ear, "maybe we could stay here with you for a while." Eleanor stood in the doorway with her hand still resting on the frame, unsure whether it was to support herself or to ground the disbelief. Jeremy stared down at his shoes. "It's just until we get things sorted," he muttered. "We've been through a rough patch." Cassidy jumped in, her voice light like confetti. "You shouldn't be alone in this big house anyway. Think of it as mutually helpful. We help you, you help us." Something in Eleanor's gut twisted. Not quite dread. Not quite hope, a gray space she had grown familiar with in recent years. "I suppose," Eleanor said slowly, "there's space." And there was. The house had 4 bedrooms, and the basement was already empty. Cassidy moved in that weekend with a flurry of boxes and scented candles, speaking loudly on her phone as she directed Jeremy where to put what. Within days, the living room curtains were replaced with something sheer and sterile. The old carpet runner Eleanor adored, bought on a honeymoon trip to Charleston, was rolled up and taken to the cleaners, though it never came back. Cassidy began her campaign politely at first. "You don't want to be going up and down those stairs too often, Eleanor," she said with a grin that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I mean, you're not 25 anymore." She said it again the next week this time, folding towels at the kitchen counter. "I was thinking," she began casually, "it might be safer and well better if we turned the master bedroom into a family room for the kids. You know, space to play Be Loud. You could take the attic room. It's cozy, private." The attic. Eleanor had not set foot up there in years. It was hot in the summer, freezing in the winter, and the stairs were steep and cruel. But Cassidy's tone was wrapped in so much feigned concern that rejecting the idea felt oddly confrontational. Jeremy stayed quiet during the conversation, choosing instead to fumble with the coffee maker. Eleanor said nothing, just nodded and stared at the dining table, remembering the countless Thanksgivings held there, the laughter, the one time Howard dropped an entire roast goose and blamed the cat. That table was pushed against the wall now, making space for what Cassidy called open concept flow. A week later, Eleanor found herself packing up her bedroom. Cassidy had offered to help, but Eleanor declined. She moved slowly, boxing up framed photographs, journals, and the perfume bottle Howard had given her on their 10th anniversary. She didn't cry, but her hands trembled slightly when she took down the mirror above the dresser. Behind it, etched faintly into the wall, was a date, April 6, 1978, the day Jeremy was born. She hadn't realized how deeply the house had become an extension of her body. Each scratch on the floor a wrinkle, each creak a heartbeat. By the following Friday, Eleanor stood in the attic, now converted hastily with a twin mattress and a small desk. Cassidy had painted the walls a garish shade of sunrise coral and installed plastic bins for storage. The single window was clouded with dust. When Eleanor opened it, the wind brought in the smell of wet pine and distant decay. Cassidy came up behind her with a folded quilt. "See, cozy, right?" she said, placing the quilt down. "You'll love it up here." Eleanor turned to face her. "This used to be the room where I kept the old manuscripts, Howard's notes, my journals. It wasn't meant for sleeping." Cassidy gave a laugh that was more air than sound. "Well, it's all about repurposing now, isn't it? Times change." Yes, Eleanor thought, but not all change is progress. She lay awake that night, staring at the sloped ceiling. Her knees ached. The air was dry. Somewhere below, she could hear Cassidy's laughter echoing up the stairs like a distant siren. Jeremy didn't come up to check on her. No one did. She stared at the shadows on the ceiling until they began to shift and breathe, forming the shape of her past Howard's face on the night he died. Jeremy's back as he stormed out, the sharp slam of the front door, and the stillness that followed. The house hadn't been silent that night. It had been stunned. And now, years later, it was happening again. But this time Eleanor would listen, not just to the walls, but to herself. Under a gauzy sheet of twilight, the attic whispered with old air and unspoken regrets. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her figure framed by the flickering bulb Cassidy had hung haphazardly from the rafters. The space smelled of varnish, old paper, and faint mildew, a library gutted of warmth. The attic had once been a storage haven for her archives, handwritten letters from decades past, and Howard's scattered notebooks of unfinished novels. Now it had a mattress, cheap plastic wrapped, and a rickety nightstand, with one drawer that didn't close all the way. She walked slowly across the floor, her steps tentative on the warped boards. There was one window, small and rectangular, covered with a faded curtain that did little to conceal the view beyond the overgrown cemetery on the hill. Willow Creek graveyard. The sight of it struck her harder than she'd expected. Her husband's headstone was just beyond the far maple tree, obscured by ivy and years. For a moment she felt him watching her, like the house itself wanted to speak. Her breath fogged the glass. By morning, Eleanor had folded her nightgown into the drawer and stacked a few novels on the floor beside the bed. Old companions she refused to leave behind. Jane Eyre, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, and a tattered copy of Great Expectations. She held the Dickens close for a moment, not reading, just touching its familiar spine, like it could keep her warm. Cassidy called up the stairs around 9:30 a.m., her voice sugary and stiff. Breakfast, Eleanor, eggs and toast. Eleanor made her way down with the caution of someone who no longer trusted their own footing. By the time she reached the kitchen, Jeremy was already walking out, coffee in hand, barely making eye contact. Cassidy smiled without lifting her eyes from her phone. "Oh," she said, a twitch of surprise in her voice. "I thought you might still be asleep." "We already ate." "Sorry." Eleanor looked at the stove. Cold. No plates on the table, just crumbs. "I thought you said breakfast," she said quietly. Cassidy stood brushing invisible lint from her leggings. "Right, I meant breakfast was earlier. You'll have to be quicker next time. Maybe we can get you a little clock upstairs." That smile again. Not quite cruel, not quite kind. The kind of smile that meant, "We're done here." Eleanor didn't reply. She made herself a cup of tea, slowly, hands shaking slightly as she reached for the sugar. It wasn't where she left it. "Cassidy," she said over her shoulder. "Have you moved the tea tins?" Cassidy tilted her head. "Just organizing a bit. The kitchen was a mess. We figured we'd streamline things, make it more efficient." That evening, Eleanor returned to her attic to find that the quilt she had folded neatly at the foot of the bed was gone. In its place was a scratchy gray throw that smelled faintly of mothballs. She blinked. Her reading glasses, which she'd left on the nightstand, were missing. She opened the drawer. Empty. The drawer that just this morning had held her journal. She stood very still, her fingers on the cracked wood. There had been 3 journals in total, her private archives stretching back 40 years. Every thought she hadn't dared say aloud since Howard's death. Every letter she'd never sent to Marcus. Every argument she'd had with Jeremy, recorded not to indict, but to understand. She kept them in sequence. She wrote in them religiously. And now, gone. Downstairs, Cassidy's laughter echoed faintly through the vents. The next morning, Eleanor asked directly. "My notebooks," she said. "The ones from the drawer." Cassidy looked genuinely puzzled for a second too long. "Oh, those," she said at last. "They were falling apart. I figured they were trash. Jeremy helped me take out a bunch of old junk yesterday, just trying to help you declutter. You'll feel freer, trust me." She said it with such breezy confidence that Eleanor momentarily questioned her own memory. But that night she scoured the garbage bins behind the house. Nothing. Inside the attic, the silence changed. It wasn't just absence anymore, it was watching. Days passed. The changes multiplied like cracks in plaster. Books disappeared from her bedside. A small photo of her with Annabeth, once propped on the desk, vanished without comment. Cassidy began rearranging furniture in the house, removing the high-backed chair Eleanor had always used in the sunroom and replacing it with something modern and beige. "You weren't using it anymore," Cassidy explained. "Jeremy and I are trying to give the place a fresh vibe, something that breathes." "Breathes." Eleanor said nothing. She felt like something in her chest had stopped breathing weeks ago. Then came the incident with the pills. Cassidy had insisted on organizing Eleanor's medications, too many bottles too confusing, and presented her with a neat little weekly tray. One evening, Eleanor felt her heartbeat stutter like an old metronome catching in place. She checked the tray. Her heart medication slot was empty for the day. Cassidy called calmly into the room, claimed Eleanor must have taken it and forgotten. "It's common," she said gently. "Don't worry. We'll get you a memory journal, like a little planner." A planner. In place of the journals Cassidy had thrown away. Eleanor didn't argue. She nodded. But the next day she took a photograph of her pill tray with her flip phone before taking the dose. That night she took another picture, compared them. Her heart meds were still untouched. When she confronted Cassidy, the woman gasped in horror. "I must have miscounted, Eleanor. I'd never. God, I'm so sorry." But Eleanor saw it then, just a flicker. Cassidy's eyes darted not with guilt, but calculation. Not did I do wrong, but did she catch me? Eleanor sat on the edge of her narrow bed that night, the phone clutched in her hands. She stared at the pixelated image of her pill tray, zoomed in until it became nothing but tiny squares of doubt and confirmation. and something deep inside her, a part that had been hibernating for years, stirred. She opened Jane Eyre not to read, but to retrieve the envelope she'd hidden inside the back cover. The emergency contact info for her lawyer written in her own hand. She hadn't spoken to him in over a year, not since updating her will. But maybe it was time. Eleanor wasn't afraid of dying. She had long ago made peace with that. But she was afraid of erasure, of being emptied from her own life like a room repainted until no trace of her ever remained. She stood up and looked at herself in the narrow attic mirror. The lines on her face were maps. Her eyes still held something defiant. "What are you trying to do, Cassidy?" she whispered to the reflection. "Turn me into wallpaper." And beneath the quiet rage, beneath the slow erosion of space and memory, a new thought emerged. No more. She reached under the bed and pulled out an old tape recorder, one she used to use during her library story hours. It was dusty, unplugged for years. She tested the batteries. Still alive. That night, Eleanor whispered into the recorder. September 17th. Cassidy removed my medication for the second time. Jeremy silent. Photographic evidence secured. We'll update again tomorrow. She clicked it off and tucked it beneath the mattress. Then slowly she turned off the light, letting the attic fold over her again like a story half read. But now at least she had a pen. Under the stillness of late afternoon, when the sun tilted just enough to cast the attic in a slanted wash of gold and shadow, Eleanor sat on the floor with her knees stiff and hands buried deep inside the bottom drawer of her old cherrywood dresser, the only piece of furniture she had insisted on bringing up from her bedroom downstairs. The drawer had once held scarves and winter gloves, but now it had become a quiet archive for what she called just-in-case things. Old letters, postcards, notes scribbled on napkins, and receipts long since faded. What she didn't expect to find was a crisp white envelope, unlabeled, unfamiliar, and oddly out of place. No stamp, no return address, just her name written in a slanted, unfamiliar cursive on the front. She hesitated for a beat before opening it. Inside, folded in thirds, was a single-page legal document, a durable power of attorney, allegedly signed by Eleanor Whitmore 3 weeks prior. The signature matched hers exactly, too exactly, and the fingerprints. She knew her own. Anyone who had shelved as many books as she had could recognize the worn swirls on her own thumb like the back of a library card. But she had never signed this. The document granted Cassidy R. Whitmore full authority over Eleanor's medical and financial decisions in the event of cognitive decline or functional limitation. Eleanor didn't breathe, not for a full 30 seconds. Her fingers trembled as she reached into the envelope again. A yellow sticky note folded once. "Don't trust them. This isn't right. You didn't sign this." No name, just that, scrawled in a rushed, uneven script. She pressed the paper flat on the floorboards, heart thudding hard in her chest. Someone had seen what was happening. Someone had tried to warn her. Downstairs laughter floated up through the vents, Cassidy's voice too high and too easy, Jeremy deeper trailing along behind. They were already preparing for her surrender, gently like boiling a frog, 1 degree at a time. She folded the paper, slid it into an old hardcover copy of Wuthering Heights, and tucked it beneath a floorboard near the radiator. And then she waited. The next morning, Eleanor stood by the front window with her tea, watching the street, the way she had every morning for decades, waiting for the boy on the red Schwinn with the shoulder bag full of headlines and coupons. Milo, 12 years old, skinny in that half-grown way, with messy hair and glasses too large for his face. He used to visit the front porch library Eleanor ran when he was 7. The first book he ever borrowed was Holes by Louis Sachar. She remembered because he returned it 3 days early and asked if she had anything with more sadness but a cool ending. Lately, he'd been zipping past the house without stopping, but this morning, as if summoned by something unspoken, he slowed his bike and looked up at the window. Eleanor waved. He hesitated, then turned the bike, sharply pedaled up the path, and stood on the porch like someone arriving at an old memory. "You don't do the library anymore?" he asked. Eleanor smiled, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. "The books are still here, but the shelves are under siege." Milo furrowed his brow. "What's siege mean?" "It means something sacred is being taken by force." He nodded slowly as if that explained more than just the shelves. She opened the door. From then on, he came every afternoon. They sat by the attic window when the weather was warm or downstairs by the dusty fireplace when Cassidy was away. Eleanor pulled books from her secret stash, reading aloud at first, then letting Milo take over when her voice cracked from emotion or memory. He was quick to notice things. That Cassidy never knocked before entering, that Eleanor never touched the tea Cassidy brought her, that Jeremy didn't speak much unless prompted. And Eleanor noticed things too. The way Milo sat with his back to the wall, the way his eyes flicked to the staircase every few minutes. He was watching, absorbing. One Thursday after they finished a chapter of The Giver, Milo looked up suddenly. "Why don't you record what they say?" he asked. Eleanor blinked. "Excuse me, like a podcast or something." "My brother does that with his band. You can get microphones on Amazon that look like flower pots or picture frames. Real spy stuff." She didn't answer right away. She just stared at him. And he, being a boy who grew up around adults more than kids, didn't repeat himself. He let the silence speak. "Would you help me?" she finally asked. He nodded. "We'll need a flower vase, though, and a mic, and a plan." That weekend, while Cassidy was visiting her sister in Portland and Jeremy took the kids to a soccer tournament, Eleanor and Milo transformed the sunroom back into what it once was, a command center of truth. Milo brought over a small recording device disguised as a ceramic sunflower pot. He'd saved up from his paper route and used his mom's Amazon account. "You sure this is legal?" Eleanor asked, half joking. Milo shrugged. "They don't care about legal. Why should we?" It was the most defiant thing she'd heard all week. They placed the vase on the living room side table where Cassidy liked to take her afternoon Zoom calls. Milo showed Eleanor how to operate the tiny switch beneath the base, how to check for blinking lights. He even programmed it to upload recordings to a private cloud drive connected to a dummy email account, misswhitmorelibrary@gmail.com. The name made Eleanor laugh out loud for the first time in weeks. Every day, while Cassidy rearranged furniture or took calls or whispered in corners, Eleanor turned on the device. Every evening, Milo returned and collected the files, archiving them like precious artifacts. Within 5 days, they had hours of recordings. Cassidy making phone calls to a legal firm in Salem, referencing the old bird upstairs and expediting the process. Cassidy snapping at Jeremy. "She's not going to just sign it, Jeremy. That's why we need pressure. Start forgetting her meds more often. If she misses enough doses, we can get a doctor's note." Jeremy didn't argue, just sighed. But it wasn't just the words. It was the tone. The way Cassidy's voice hardened when she thought no one was listening. The glee beneath her sighs. One night after Milo had gone and Eleanor was alone again with the hum of the radiator and the whistle of the old windows, she sat on her mattress, played the most recent file and let it wash over her like a storm. Cassidy's voice cold, tight, surgical. "She doesn't even realize she signed the papers. Honestly, if I were her, I'd be grateful someone's finally taking control." Eleanor paused the recording. Her fingers curled slowly around the edge of the mattress. Not grief, not fear. Rage. Controlled, quiet, boiling like an unopened kettle. They wanted her gone. They wanted her erased, sterilized, folded into a version of herself that no longer existed. But she wasn't going anywhere. She clicked record on the tape deck she still kept under her bed. Her voice was calm, measured the same tone she'd once used to narrate audiobooks at the town library. "September 21st, she said. "They're accelerating." Cassidy used the phrase expediting the process. Jeremy remained silent. Evidence archived, Milo assisting. "I am not alone." She stopped the tape, closed the deck, and smiled. For the first time, she smiled like a woman who had stopped watching the floodwaters rise and had started building a raft. Tomorrow, she and Milo would plan the next step. Placement, trigger phrases, redundancies, external backup drives. The war for her life had begun. And Eleanor Whitmore, former librarian of Willow Creek, was not only ready to fight, she intended to win. It started with the knock, 3 short raps on the front door. Firm, professional. Eleanor stood at the top of the staircase, her hand resting lightly on the old banister, listening. She knew that kind of knock. It wasn't neighborly. It wasn't curious. It was the kind of knock someone practiced in school. Cassidy opened the door with a brightness that didn't match the gray outside. "Dr. Klein." Right on time, she chirped, stepping aside. The man who entered was young, perhaps mid-30s, with round glasses and a too-eager expression. He carried a small leather satchel and wore a sweater vest under his blazer. He had the cautious politeness of someone trained to smile at strangers who don't trust him. Eleanor came down halfway on the stairs, slow but direct. "Who's this?" she asked. Cassidy tilted her head like she was trying not to be offended. "This is Dr. Klein. He's a psychiatrist. Just a quick consultation, Mom." "I didn't ask for any consultation," Eleanor replied, voice low and firm. Dr. Klein cleared his throat. "I've been asked to conduct a short cognitive assessment. Just a few questions, nothing invasive." "I'm not confused," Dr. Klein, Eleanor said, descending another step. "I know who I am, where I am, and exactly what's going on in this house." He smiled gently. "It's just a routine evaluation, Ms. Whitmore. Who authorized it?" Eleanor's voice sharpened. Cassidy stepped forward. "Jeremy and I thought it would be helpful. You've been forgetful lately. The doctor just wants to help, maybe even suggest something to improve memory." "I don't need help remembering," Eleanor replied coldly. "What I need is for you to stop treating me like a project." Dr. Klein looked between the two women and adjusted his glasses. "I can conduct this upstairs privately, if that would be more comfortable." "I'm not going anywhere with you," Eleanor said. Cassidy gave a little gasp. "Mother, please, you're being irrational." "No," Eleanor snapped. "I'm being cornered." Cassidy turned to Dr. Klein with a smile stretched too tight. "Give us a moment, will you?" He nodded and stepped into the dining room where the faint ticking of the antique wall clock seemed suddenly too loud. Eleanor turned on Cassidy the moment he disappeared. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Cassidy's voice dropped. "We're doing what's necessary. You've become unpredictable, paranoid. You talk to yourself in that attic. You think people are stealing your books. I never said. And you refuse your medication. Jeremy saw it himself." Eleanor's hands clenched at her sides. "You've been sabotaging my medication," she hissed. "I have proof. I know what you're doing." Cassidy didn't blink. "You're unstable, Eleanor. You've been writing things down that never happened. You make accusations without evidence." "I have evidence." That finally made Cassidy falter, just a blink. Eleanor pressed. "Recordings, copies, hidden off-site. I'm not as alone as you think." The younger woman recovered quickly. "Jeremy will never believe you." At that, Eleanor smiled, a sad, broken kind of smile. "Then let's ask him." She turned, walked back to the base of the stairs, and called out Jeremy. He appeared at the top of the hallway, barefoot, holding a cup of coffee. He looked down at them like he'd been waiting to be summoned. "Your wife is trying to have me declared incompetent," Eleanor said. "She's brought a psychiatrist into my house, without my consent." Jeremy didn't move. "She's been tampering with my medication, destroying my journals. You know this." Still no response. Eleanor's voice cracked not with weakness but with fury. "You saw the papers. You heard what she said about the house, about locking me away. You know she's lying." Jeremy looked at his mother for a long time, face unreadable. Then he said quietly, "You've been having a hard time adjusting, Mom. Maybe this is for the best." Eleanor stared at him, stunned. Cassidy placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, eyes triumphant. Jeremy took a long sip of coffee and disappeared down the hallway, the sound of his retreating footsteps somehow louder than any scream. It was the first time in Eleanor's life that silence physically hurt. Later that afternoon, Eleanor sat with Milo on the back porch. The air was dry and the wind tugged softly at the hem of her cardigan. Milo tapped on the screen of his tablet, brows furrowed. "I found it," he said. Eleanor turned toward him slowly. "From yesterday. You left the mic on all night. You won't believe this one." He played the clip, Cassidy's voice low and deliberate. "If we can get her out of the picture legally, the house is ours. No contest. The kids get the inheritance. We can sell it before the year's out." Jeremy's voice followed. "She won't go quietly." Cassidy again colder now. "Then we make it impossible for her to stay. Starve her options. We control the narrative. If we get her in a facility, the property's ours by spring. We just need one doctor's note, one signature." Milo paused the recording. They sat in silence. Eleanor felt no shock, only confirmation. A quiet, dead kind of vindication. "They want me institutionalized," she said more to herself than to Milo. "They want the house." Milo didn't answer right away. Then he said, "We should go public." Eleanor blinked. "What do you mean? You're not the only one this has happened to." "I read about it. Elder fraud, guardianship scams. If we go public, neighborhood, board, library, donors, the press, someone will care. Someone will stop them. Eleanor considered this. The risk, the exposure, the cost. But then she looked down at her own hands, once strong enough to shelve 100 books an hour, now trembling in the aftershock of betrayal. They wanted her gone, but they didn't realize Eleanor Whitmore had cataloged thousands of stories in her life, and she was done being a footnote. It was just after 300 a.m. when Eleanor slid the final micro camera behind the ficus in the corner of the living room, the one Cassidy always moved when she thought no one noticed. The pot was cracked on one side, hollow enough to hide a small lens one Milo had salvaged from his brother's gaming setup. It connected wirelessly to Eleanor's laptop hidden beneath a pile of vintage quilting magazines in the attic. Earlier that week, Cassidy had made another late-night phone call from the sunroom, whispering in that hard-clipped voice she reserved for people she didn't need to lie to. Eleanor had recorded every word. "It's done," Cassidy had said, phone pressed to her cheek, fingers toying with the fireplace mantle. "The POA's in place. Once the original documents are gone, we're clear." A pause. "No, she hasn't seen the safe. Jeremy thinks she might be hiding something upstairs, maybe old versions of the will. I'll check the attic again tomorrow. If it's not there, I'll try the basement file drawer. We'll torch whatever's not scanned." Click. That night, Eleanor hadn't slept. Her hands shook too hard, her chest burned, not with fear anymore, but with clarity. The line had been crossed. Cassidy wasn't just preparing to erase her from the house she was hunting history, removing fingerprints, Eleanor's legacy. The next day, while Cassidy took the kids to a museum downtown, Eleanor returned from the hospital pharmacy where she had independently refilled her prescription and spoken quietly to the attending nurse about recent symptoms, headaches, fatigue, blurred vision. "Could be stress," the nurse said gently. "Or something worse," Eleanor replied. "Could I request a toxicology panel?" The nurse blinked, surprised. "Of course, but may I ask why?" Eleanor smiled faintly. "Let's just say I want to rule things out before I disappear." Back home, she found the safe in the hallway closet door had been scratched, as if someone had jammed something into the lock and failed. It wasn't broken, just disturbed. The lacquer around the keypad was chipped. That evening, Eleanor asked Milo to place one of their backup cameras on a timer, facing the closet, just in case. It captured the footage at 2:47 a.m. Cassidy in pajamas holding a flashlight between her teeth, trying combination after combination. After 3 failed tries, she stepped back, cursed, then knelt beside the lock with what looked like a nail file and tension wrench. The footage was grainy but clear. Cassidy was trying to break into the safe. The timestamp burned in white in the lower corner. Eleanor smiled bitterly. It was a perfect shot. The next afternoon, Milo edited together 2 minutes of the footage and emailed it to a hidden drive. He added the audio of the phone call from 2 nights earlier. Then he looked up from the laptop and said, "Now we hit harder." But fate didn't wait for Eleanor's next move. That evening, while washing a single plate in the attic sink, Eleanor's knees buckled. The room spun. Her hands slipped from the basin, crashing the dish to the floor as her breath shortened into a dry gasp. The ceiling twisted above her like a carousel of ghost light. She felt her knees hit the floor, heard the blood in her ears roar louder than any scream. And then, darkness. It was Milo who found her. He had come to return a book, Ray Bradbury's Something Wicked This Way Comes. He knocked on the attic door twice. No answer. He climbed the stairs anyway. He saw her curled on the floor, pale lips slightly blue. He didn't hesitate. He dialed 911 from his own phone, then sprinted to the kitchen and found Cassidy's phone on the counter. Locked. He grabbed Eleanor's instead, scrolled to the ice contact marked lawyer, and texted. Eleanor collapsed. "Please come, don't trust Cassidy, this is Milo." When the paramedics arrived, Cassidy tried to control the narrative, crying, blaming Eleanor's fragile heart, suggesting it might be dementia-related. But Milo pushed his way forward. "She was fine yesterday," he said. "She's been fine for weeks. Something's wrong." At the hospital, blood work was drawn. IVs started. 3 hours later, a young physician entered the room where Eleanor now lay conscious but weak. She looked up at him with tired eyes. He closed the curtain. "Ms. Whitmore," he began gently, "your toxicology shows low but consistent levels of digoxin, more than your current prescription calls for." Eleanor blinked. You mean overdose? More like accumulation, he said carefully. Not fatal, but chronic. Like someone's been giving you just enough to affect cognition, circulation, confusion, dizziness, fainting. Do you control your meds? I thought I did, she whispered. He paused, then added, We're required to report suspected elder abuse when medical tampering is involved. Eleanor sat up straighter. No, she said, not yet. Ms. Whitmore, she cut him off. I need 48 hours, then report everything. The doctor hesitated, then nodded. 48. But we'll keep you overnight for observation. Later that night, Eleanor wrote a single line in the hospital's notepad. I won't be erased. And that was the moment she stopped enduring. She started plotting. The following morning, Eleanor called her lawyer. Then she called Milo. Then she called the Willow Creek Community Board, specifically the president of the Historic Preservation Society who had known her for 20 years. I'd like to host a gathering, she said, voice calm, but ice steady, to share something from the archives. The woman on the phone laughed. Oh, Eleanor, are you finally letting people see your film reels? Yes, Eleanor said, you could say that. They scheduled the gathering for Friday at 7:30 p.m. under the guise of a neighborhood history night, promising a nostalgic film screening tea cookies and maybe a few surprises from the past. Cassidy didn't suspect anything. She was too busy boasting to a friend over the phone captured once again on Eleanor's recorder. Once she's out of the house for a week, we'll say she's no longer fit to return. Jeremy's already getting quotes from stagers. Eleanor returned home on Thursday wearing beige and silence. Cassidy met her with concern laced in false sweetness. You poor thing, she purred. What a scare. I was just so worried. Eleanor smiled. I imagine you were. Cassidy blinked at the response. Well, good thing you're back in time for the neighborhood screening. I saw the flyer. Did you really organize it from the hospital? I had help, Eleanor said. You'd be surprised what you can accomplish with a strong enough reason. Cassidy didn't like that answer, but she smiled anyway. Eleanor spent the entire day Friday preparing the sunroom. She borrowed a projector from the library board, set up rows of folding chairs, placed flower arrangements near the walls. Milo ran wires from the microcamera archive to the laptop, then to the projector. He looked at Eleanor. You sure you're ready for this? Eleanor adjusted the lace on her sleeves. Oh, sweetheart, she said, voice iron, I've been ready for 20 years. At 7:32 p.m., the neighbors began to arrive. By 7:45, every seat was full. By 7:49, Cassidy entered holding a tray of cookies, radiant as a hostess. Jeremy followed distracted eyes, scanning the crowd. And by 7:59, the lights dimmed. Eleanor walked to the front of the room, stood beside the projector, and cleared her throat. Thank you for coming, she said. Tonight, I wanted to share something personal, a glimpse into what history looks like when it refuses to be rewritten. She clicked a button. The first video rolled. Cassidy in the middle of the night trying to open the safe. Gasps from the crowd. Then audio. If we get her in a facility, the property's ours by spring. Cassidy's voice, crisp, clear, cold. Jeremy's voice, she won't go quietly. Eleanor didn't look at them. She just let the truth play. She had finally turned on the light, and now everyone could see. The rain came down like war drums on the roof of the old Willow Creek Library. Steady, deliberate, merciless. The kind of storm that silenced everything else, no birdsong, no traffic, no distant bark of the neighbor's dog. Just the slap of water on concrete and the crackle of wind slipping through fractured window panes. Inside, the smell of aged paper and lemon oil clung to the air like an incantation. Eleanor stood at the center of the library's main hall, where bookshelves once lined the walls like cathedral pews. The room had been gutted when funding ran out 5 years ago, turned into a community event space used mostly for birthday parties and failed poetry readings. But tonight it would host a reckoning. Rows of folding chairs stretched from the projector's shadowed perch at the back of the room to the heavy velvet blackout curtain Eleanor and Milo had nailed across the old windows. The entire east side of the building was cloaked in darkness, save for the soft blue glow of the laptop screen and the whir of the antique reel-to-digital projector. Milo paced near the circuit breaker box, headphones slung around his neck like a miniature film director. His eyes flicked from screen to crowd to Eleanor to the flash drive dangling from her necklace. They're coming, he said, pointing to the entrance. A lot of them. And they did come, one by one, in raincoats and with umbrellas dripping onto the doormat. The people of Willow Creek filed in. Old women from the historical society Eleanor once led. Parents of children who had learned to read from her Saturday story time. Grocery clerks. Teachers. A few of Milo's classmates, even his mother, a redhead with crow's feet and suspicion in her eyes. Eleanor stood to the side quietly greeting them, hands clasped in front like a docent before an exhibit. No one knew what exactly they'd come to see, just that Eleanor had something to show, and that Milo insisted with fire in his voice that it was important. By 7:41 p.m. there wasn't an empty seat in the house. Cassidy arrived at 7:48, fashionably late as always, Jeremy trailing behind her like a shadow without purpose. She wore a gray cashmere wrap and carried a tray of shortbread cookies she'd picked up from the bakery 10 minutes earlier. Her smile was perfect, white, calculated, magnetic. She made her way through the crowd, greeting people by name, kissing cheeks, placing her tray on the back table like she owned the place. Eleanor did not speak to her. At exactly 8:00 p.m., Eleanor stepped forward, her shoes clicking softly against the wood floor. The hush came not because someone rang a bell or called for quiet, but because something about her posture commanded it. She looked at the crowd, her eyes moving slowly over each face. Then she reached up, removed the flash drive from her chain, and handed it to Milo without a word. He plugged it into the laptop. The projector buzzed, the speakers clicked, and the screen lit up. At first, it was a simple image Cassidy framed by the dim lighting of Eleanor's living room phone pressed to her ear. Her voice emerged amplified through the room like a courtroom speaker, cold, unhurried. "If we can get her out of the picture legally, the house is ours. No contest. The kids get the inheritance. We can sell it before the year's out." Gasps erupted like small fires in the audience. Then came Jeremy's voice. "She won't go quietly." Then Cassidy again laughing. "That's why we need pressure. Start forgetting her meds more often. If she misses enough doses, we can get a doctor's note." A woman in the front row covered her mouth with her hand. The footage changed night vision, now time-stamped. Cassidy kneeling beside the family-safe flashlight between her teeth, tools in hand, failing repeatedly to pry open the lock. The murmurs turned to full-fledged voices now. "What is this? Is that?" That's breaking and entering into her own mother-in-law's safe. The final video showed Cassidy pouring Eleanor's pills into a separate bottle, then replacing them with unmarked tablets. The room went dead silent. Cassidy rose from her seat like something had snapped inside her. This is. She turned toward the projector. Milo stepped in front of her. "Don't." Cassidy shoved him aside hard enough that he hit the projector table. The image on screen shook violently but held. She lunged forward again, hand reaching for the cord. "Do not touch that." Eleanor's voice boomed louder than she'd spoken in decades. It split through the crowd like thunder, but Cassidy grabbed the plug anyway, and then a hand clamped her wrist. It was Milo's mother. She wasn't tall, but her grip was iron. She twisted Cassidy's wrist just enough to stop her, then turned and shouted, "Someone call the police, now!" Cassidy struggled for half a second, then froze as 3 other women stepped in. From the front row, from the middle aisle, even the elderly librarian who once ran the school archive. "You are not going anywhere," she said, voice flat. "Not after what we've just heard." Cassidy looked toward Jeremy. He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't stand. Eleanor stood at the front of the room, still and pale, but her spine impossibly straight. She held a folder in her hands. Copies of every document, every transcript, every audio file, and dropped it onto the community table near the projector like a gavel hitting a bench. "This," she said, "is what happens when silence meets evidence. You tried to erase me, to rewrite me, but I'm a librarian, Cassidy. We don't forget, we preserve." Rain battered the roof above like applause from the sky. Outside, red and blue lights danced between oak trees. Inside, no one moved. Cassidy's voice had always been the loudest in the house, but now she was nothing but static. And Eleanor, she was the headline. The first patrol car rolled up just as the last frame of Cassidy's betrayal faded from the screen. Blue and red lights spun wildly against the rain-streaked library windows, casting fractured colors across the crowd, still seated in stunned silence. It felt like a stage lit in alarm, like a siren from some ancient play, warning of a reckoning long overdue. Milo stood near the entrance, soaked to the bone, hair matted to his forehead, one hand still gripping his tablet. His other hand held his phone, where the email history clearly showed, sent to Officer Rhonda Giles, Willow Creek PD, subject urgent. Elder abuse evidence time-stamped 2 hours earlier, just in case no one believed Eleanor. But they believed her now. The door creaked open, and in stepped Officer Giles herself, rain beading on her Kevlar vest. She was mid-50s, square-jawed, with the kind of gait that said she didn't run unless she had to, and tonight she didn't need to. She scanned the room, once eyes immediately locking on Cassidy, still frozen at the projector like a cornered actress whose spotlight had betrayed her. "Cassidy Whitmore," Giles asked, her voice plain. Cassidy turned slowly, as if hoping the silence would warp reality, as if denial could rewind tape. Jeremy stood 10 feet behind her, pale unmoving. "Yes," Cassidy answered, her voice too quiet to sound like her own. "Please place your hands behind your back." The crowd gasped again, but this time no one intervened. No one reached for her. No one whispered, "This must be a mistake." Because it wasn't. It was truth finally catching up to someone who believed she could outrun it in heels and privilege. Cassidy opened her mouth to protest. Maybe to lie, maybe to cry, but before a word emerged, Officer Giles had turned her gently, firmly, and clipped the cuffs on with an audible click. "You're being arrested for attempted elder abuse, financial fraud, and falsifying medical intent for guardianship," Giles recited. "You have the right to remain silent." "Wait," Cassidy interrupted, spinning halfway. Her mascara had finally begun to betray her, running slightly beneath her right eye. "You can't do this. It's her word against mine." Giles didn't blink. "We have more than her word, ma'am. We have recordings, video footage, tampered medication samples, and a statement from her physician." Cassidy's eyes darted toward Jeremy. "Tell them," she hissed. "Tell them this wasn't my idea." Jeremy stared back like she was already someone from another life. "I never touched her meds," he said softly. But it wasn't the denial she needed. It was something worse, indifference. He was already saving himself. Giles nodded towards the second officer entering. "Take her out the back." Cassidy shrieked, not in pain, but in disbelief. The sound of someone watching their entire scaffolding of control collapse into ash. The room remained still as stone. As the door slammed shut behind her, Jeremy stepped forward, but Officer Giles held up a hand. "You need to come down to the station, Mr. Whitmore. You're not under arrest," she said, "but we need a full statement. Tonight." Jeremy hesitated, then nodded once and followed the second officer without saying a word. When the doors closed again, the silence was no longer shocked. It was reverent. Eleanor stepped forward. Her hands were steady. Her hair was damp from the condensation. Her back, though curved by years, was straight enough for this moment. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't apologize. She simply looked at the people, her people. The neighbors who once dropped off books late, who called her Ms. Whitmore with affection. The students who once fumbled over Dr. Seuss beneath her guidance. And she said, "I am not a burden." The words were a blade, quiet, sharp, irrefutable. "I am not disposable. I am not something to be written out of the will or hidden in an attic until I die." Her voice trembled not with weakness but with fury barely restrained. "I built that house. I scrubbed every floorboard. I taught 3 children to read under that roof while working nights at the library and mourning a husband who died too young and too confused." A beat. No one moved. "They called me forgetful. They told me I was confused. They told me I'd lost my grip on reality. But the only thing I lost," she said, looking straight at the empty chair Cassidy had fled from, "was time. And I'm done giving it away to anyone who sees me as furniture." One woman in the 3rd row, a parent of one of Eleanor's former students, stood, eyes glassy. "Thank you," she whispered. A man beside her stood next. Then another. Then another. Within moments, the entire room was on their feet, not clapping, not cheering, just standing, bearing witness. Milo came to her side and handed her the umbrella he'd tucked under the chair. But she didn't open it. She walked out into the storm uncovered. Rain kissed her face, but she didn't flinch. She inhaled like someone reclaiming air after years underwater. And outside, beneath the swaying lamplight, a journalist from the Willow Creek Weekly caught the scene with a trembling camera. The next morning, the front page carried her photo. "The roots of the house. Elder abuse. Uncovered in Willow Creek." Below it, a pull quote in bold serif. "I am not a burden. I am the root of that house. Within 24 hours, the article was picked up by regional news, then a Portland affiliate. Then it went viral through a national elder justice coalition. People began to write letters, some handwritten, some emailed, some posted online in public forums. My mother is living in fear of her daughter-in-law. Thank you for speaking. My father's medication was accidentally altered. We never reported it. We thought we were alone. I thought I was going crazy. I thought I was paranoid, but I'm not. Thank you, Eleanor. By the end of the week, Eleanor had been contacted by a public interest lawyer based in Salem offering to represent her civil case pro bono. She declined politely. I don't want vengeance, she said. I want narrative control. When a producer from Oregon Public Broadcasting called, asking for an interview, she gave only one condition. I get to tell the story uncut in my own words. And she did. Seated in the same library where it all came undone, she told it all. Not for revenge, not for pity, but for the record. Because some stories are too important to stay shelved, and Eleanor Whitmore had spent her whole life filing truth alphabetically. It was time the world started reading it. The courtroom was quiet. There was no gavel bang, no shouting, no explosive revelation. Just a quiet, efficient voice reading a decision that shattered decades of inheritance expectation. The court finds sufficient evidence of coercion, fraud, and neglect involving the defendant, Mr. Jeremy Whitmore. As such, the estate rights and standing power of attorney are hereby nullified. Mr. Whitmore is disinherited by order of the court, with assets returned to Ms. Eleanor Whitmore. Jeremy didn't say a word. He simply sat there in a wrinkled blazer and stared at the mahogany grain of the table in front of him. The same table that once stood in his childhood home where Eleanor had laid out fresh-baked bread and alphabet magnets. That table now bore witness to his exile not by his mother's doing, but by his own cowardice. Outside the courthouse, cameras clicked. The press wasn't swarming, but they were present. Elder justice stories didn't often trend, but this one had something more betrayal, courage, legacy. Eleanor exited the building slowly, cane in hand, Milo walking beside her like a loyal page to a queen who'd reclaimed her crown. But something inside her hadn't settled. Not yet. That evening, as the sky slipped into lavender over Willow Creek, a knock echoed from her front porch. Her house finally hers again. She opened the door and stopped. It was her eldest daughter, Rachel. Her hair was shorter now, flecked with gray eyes, glassier than Eleanor remembered. Behind her stood Thomas, the middle child, quiet, tall, with shoulders weighed down by years. They hadn't come home in over a decade. Not since the night of the argument. Not since the week after their father died, and Eleanor refused to remarry, refused to sign over the house, refused to pretend that things were okay when they were not. Rachel stepped forward, hands trembling. I saw the story, she said, voice tight. I saw everything. Eleanor didn't respond. I didn't believe you back then, Rachel continued. About Jeremy, about the pressure. I thought you were exaggerating. She reached out, one hand on the doorframe, the other hovering in the air, lost. I thought you were becoming bitter. I told people you were paranoid. I told myself that too. Her voice cracked. And then I watched the video of Cassidy, and I wanted to disappear. Eleanor didn't move. Rachel took a breath so ragged it almost broke. Mom, she whispered. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for not coming back, for not protecting you, for leaving you there alone with them. And then she stepped forward and fell into Eleanor's arms. There was no choreography, no build-up, just two women collapsing into each other, one aged by silence, the other by guilt, and weeping into each other's shoulders. Thomas looked down at his feet, eyes wet, then stepped forward and placed one hand on his mother's back. It wasn't eloquent. It wasn't dramatic. But it was something that had been missing for far too long. Forgiveness wasn't immediate, but the bridge had been built. They spent the night in the kitchen. Eleanor had insisted on boiling tea herself and talked like survivors of a quiet war. They laughed about old library mishaps, cried when remembering their father's soft-spoken humor, and unraveled years of misunderstanding like a tangled ball of yarn finally brought to light. But when Rachel asked, "What happens now?" Eleanor looked at the ceiling, at the cracked plaster, at the water stain near the corner that had never quite dried. "I'm selling the house," she said simply. Rachel blinked. "You're what?" "It's not a home anymore," Eleanor said, her voice calm. "It's a monument. To love, yes, but also to pain. It's held too many silences, too many shadows. I need new air, new walls that haven't heard me cry through plaster. Thomas nodded quietly. Do you know where you'll go? He asked. Eleanor smiled. As it happens, yes. It had started with a letter, a simple envelope delivered the day before postmarked Vermont. Inside was a card with faded ink. Miss Whitmore, I don't know if you remember me, but my name is Nora Penwell. I was in your summer reading group in '96, the year we read The Giver. You gave me a copy and told me I'd understand it better when I was older. You were right. I now run a little bookstore in a small Vermont town called Maplefield. We've been trying to start a reading program for kids here. Most of them don't even own books, and I heard what happened to you. I just wanted to say, you inspired me. You saved me probably more than once. If you ever need a fresh start, we have a guest room above the store and a whole town full of children who'd love a real librarian again. With love, Nora. Eleanor read the letter 3 times before placing it on her dresser. Now at the kitchen table, she picked it up and slid it across to Rachel. When Rachel finished reading, her hands trembled. You're really going? Eleanor nodded. I gave this town 40 years, she said. It gave me 30 good ones. That's a fair trade. Milo came by the next day to help pack. He brought over 3 empty crates and a notebook full of ideas for how to build a reading club from scratch. She gave him a set of vintage bookmarks from 1982 and her library card punch tool. You'll need it, she said. Never trust a kid who says they read the whole book if there's no stamp. They both laughed. He didn't want her to go, not really, but he understood. I'll visit, he said, trying to be strong. Every summer. You better, she said. I'm making you the official archivist of the Vermont chapter. They hugged for a long time, and when she finally locked the house door for the last time, Eleanor didn't look back. Not because she didn't care, but because she'd already preserved the best parts on paper and stories in memory. It was time to build something new. The bus hissed like an old animal as it pulled up beside the cracked curb in front of Eleanor's house, no longer hers, but still full of her breath. It was just past dawn. The sky hadn't made up its mind yet. A muted violet above the hills of Willow Creek, with thin veins of light cracking through clouds that refused to surrender entirely. The air smelled of cold concrete wet grass and old lavender from the sachets she'd placed in her suitcase the night before. Eleanor stood at the foot of the driveway with 2 things. A worn leather suitcase filled mostly with books, some hers, some gifts from Milo, and a clay pot holding a small sturdy plant. It was rosemary. Milo had handed it to her the night before, his voice faltering as he said, It never forgets. That's what you told me once. Rosemary's for remembering. She held it close now, tucked between her chest and elbow like a sacred relic. The driver helped her load her suitcase, tipping his cap without asking questions. She liked that about strangers, the way they offered help without entitlement. As she stepped onto the bus, Eleanor didn't look back at the house. She had already said goodbye to every wall, every squeaky floorboard, every photograph she'd chosen to leave behind. She had done her grieving in stages like an orderly retirement of ghosts. She sat near the window. Milo stood on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, trying to keep his face still. But when she pressed her palm to the glass, he cracked just for a moment. He raised a hand and mouthed the words he couldn't yell. Thank you. The bus pulled away. Willow Creek grew smaller in the frame, then vanished altogether. Eleanor let her head rest against the cool glass, the pot of rosemary sitting beside her like a quiet traveling companion. The countryside blurred past in soft greens and rusty oranges. As miles unspooled behind her, Eleanor's thoughts did not turn to what she'd lost, but what she might still build. By the time they crossed into Vermont, snow flurries had started to dance through the air, like lost paper scraps from a book unfinished. She smiled at the thought. The town of Maplefield was barely a dot on the map, 2 blocks long, with a diner, a post office, a school no larger than a fire station, and a bookstore that looked like it had grown organically from the earth. The sign above the door read, Penwell and Pages, Books, Brews, and Belonging. A young woman with honey-colored hair stood outside, scarf wrapped twice around her neck, waving frantically. Nora Penwell, Eleanor asked as she stepped down from the bus. You look exactly how I remembered, Nora replied, except taller. They both laughed. The guest room above the shop smelled like cinnamon and old paper. There was a single bed, a small desk by the window, and shelves already filled with books, some of which had Eleanor's signature on the inside flap from her days as a librarian. You kept them, she whispered. I never let them go, Nora said. The first week passed quietly. Eleanor helped reorganize the children's corner-shelved new donations and adjusted to the hum of a different life. Her hands missed the muscle memory of tea mugs in her old kitchen, but they were soothed by the crisp touch of hardcovers and library cards. Nora printed flyers. Story time with Miss Eleanor, Saturdays at 11 a.m. The first Saturday only 3 kids came. The next 9. By the third week, the entire reading rug was full legs crossed, eyes wide, mouths open in anticipation. Eleanor sat in her old green cardigan, the rosemary plant in the windowsill beside her, reading aloud from the phantom toll booth, occasionally pausing to ask questions no one else ever asked. What would you do if you could see time? Do you think words weigh anything? Children gave answers without hesitation. They didn't treat her like an old woman, they treated her like magic. She began to write again small journal entries, short letters, mostly to herself, until one day a package arrived from Oregon. Inside, a bundle of letters written in blocky penmanship on lined paper tied together with twine. The first began simply, Dear Ms. Eleanor, I thought of a new club name, the Resistance Readers. Do you approve? It was from Milo. He wrote every 2 weeks, sometimes more. He sent book recommendations, drawings, quotes he liked, questions about philosophy. She answered every letter by hand in cursive ink, sealing each reply with a wax stamp Nora had gifted her on her birthday. Milo once wrote, You're not a chapter, you're a whole volume. She taped that one above her desk. Seasons turned. Spring came with daffodils, summer with late dusk and lemonade at book clubs, autumn with leaf piles taller than the children who kicked them apart. And then one October afternoon a new letter arrived. The envelope was different, no return address. The handwriting was familiar. She sat on the bench outside the bookstore and opened it slowly. Mom, I don't know if you'll read this. I'm not even sure you'd want to, but I owe you more than silence. I watched the video again, not the public one, the one where you stood there after the projector and everyone else had gone home. Milo left the camera running by accident. You sat in that folding chair with your hands shaking, and I saw what I refused to see before: strength. Not bitterness, not fear. Strength I never had. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know I'm trying to be better. You won't hear from me again unless you choose to. But thank you for everything you built, even if I only learned to value it when it was almost gone. Jeremy. She folded the letter, once placed it between the pages of her notebook, and stared at the horizon for a long time. No address, no return, no promise, but a flicker perhaps of something she thought had burned to ash. She went inside. There were still children to read to. There were still letters to answer. There were still roots to grow in places she'd never planted before. And Eleanor, for the first time in years, felt herself belonging not to a past, but to a future. It began with a single lantern. Eleanor had found it tucked away in a forgotten box in the back corner of the bookstore, a brass-handled oil lamp with a cracked glass shade and a wick that still remembered fire. It was Milo's words in a letter that sparked the idea. What if reading could feel like stepping into a different century? So she hung flyers 2 weeks in advance. An evening under lantern light. Children's Story Hour with Miss Eleanor. Please bring a blanket and a curious heart. The local librarian sent word. Parents cleared calendars. Nora dusted off every spare cushion in the store. And on the first Friday of October, just after sunset, they gathered. The field behind Penwell and Page's had been trimmed, the grass still damp with autumn dew. Blankets spread across the slope, children curled into parents' laps. A string of flickering lanterns marked the edge of the gathering like sentinels from another time. Eleanor stood at the center, holding her rosemary pot like a badge. She didn't use a microphone. She didn't need to. The hush of the field was enough. She began not with a fairy tale but a memory. There was a time, she said, voice steady and slow, when I lived at the top of a house I had paid for. A house I scrubbed clean with my hands, where I raised children and buried love. And one day someone I trusted told me that I was too much. She paused. The children watched her the way they watched fireflies, not with fear, but with awe. They moved me upstairs. They forgot my medicine. They hid my books. They tried to convince the world that I had forgotten who I was. A mother in the back reached over and took her daughter's hand. But you see, Eleanor said, smiling, the thing about being surrounded by books all your life is, you learn to recognize fiction when you hear it. The adults chuckled softly, and so I fought back. Not with fists, but with pages, with recordings, with a little boy who delivered newspapers and believed in justice. The wind rustled leaves scattered in polite applause. I tell you this, not so you feel sorry for me, Eleanor continued, but so you remember something very important. Your value is not given to you by someone else. You carry it inside, always, even when they try to bury it in an attic. A silence followed, full, not empty. Then Eleanor opened a book, Charlotte's Web. She read aloud under the oil lantern's golden circle, her voice weaving through the night like music on air. When she said the final line, "It is not often that someone comes along who is a true friend and a good writer," Charlotte was both. Several children clapped instinctively while others simply sat wide-eyed as if they had just seen something invisible revealed. It was the first lantern reading night. It would not be the last. Each month they returned more children, more parents, more pillows and blankets. It became tradition and then ritual, a calendar fixture, a heartbeat of the town. On the 5th such evening, Eleanor added something new. After the story, she stood and said, "Tonight I'd like to share a chapter from my own life. No dragons, no castles, but a very tall attic." And so she told her story again, but this time softer, without sharp edges. No venom, no blame, only clarity and truth. She spoke of fear, of loneliness, of rediscovery. She spoke of courage growing not all at once, but in slow inches like vines toward light. She never named Cassidy. She never shamed Jeremy. She only described what had happened and what she had chosen to do in response. And in doing so, she gave the crowd something far more powerful than spectacle. She gave them grace. The children began calling her Ms. Elm, short for Eleanor the Memory Keeper. One of them drew a picture of her sitting under a giant tree holding an open book that glowed like a lantern. Nora framed it and hung it by the register. That winter, the bookstore received a visitor from New York, a documentary filmmaker named Daniel Knox. He'd read about Eleanor in a viral online forum for elder rights, but it wasn't the legal case that intrigued him. "It was your story night," he said, sipping cider at the reading nook. "Your voice, the way you didn't let anger be your narrator." She laughed gently. "I've had enough of anger. It's an impatient author." He smiled. "I want to tell your story. Film it. Not as a court case, not as a takedown piece, but as a journey. From the attic to here." "To freedom?" she asked. "To freedom," he nodded. She thought about it. She thought about the children, the letters from Milo, the rosemary that now bloomed like a tiny bush near her window. Then she nodded. "But only if we end with the lantern night," she said. "And only if I get to choose the last book we read." He agreed. Production began quietly. Small cameras, soft lighting. No makeup trailers or contracts. Just conversations, her voice, the town, the children, reading by lantern glow. She told her story in the back room of the bookstore, sunlight washing through the window behind her. She wore the green cardigan. She kept the rosemary pot nearby. Daniel filmed her reading a letter from Milo aloud, the one that said, "You didn't just teach me to read books. You taught me to read myself." And for once her eyes shimmered, not from sadness, but from light. The screen was black. Then came the sound, faint at first, of an old tape reel spinning, clicking gently as if waking from a long sleep. A soft hum, then a beep, and finally a boy's voice. Older now, deeper, but unmistakably him. "Hi, Miss Eleanor, it's Milo." The screen slowly faded in, not to a grand building, not to a crowded hall, but to a porch. Eleanor sat there wrapped in her green cardigan legs, tucked under a wool blanket. The old rosemary plant rested on the table beside her, bigger, now strong, fragrant, wild in a beautiful way. Its roots had taken hold in Vermont soil. In one hand she held an open book, in the other a portable tape player, the kind no one used anymore except perhaps those who remembered the value of voice over polish. "I wanted to say thank you." Milo's voice continued soft, unhurried, "not just for the stories or the books or the afternoons under the sycamore tree, but for something I didn't even know I needed back then." The camera drifted in slowly. No rush, capturing every quiet detail, the edges of her eyes, the way the light touched her hair like memory itself, the porch railings worn smooth by weather and time. You didn't just teach me how to read books. Milo paused in the recording. A quiet breath. You taught me how to not bow my head, how to stand up, how to speak when my voice shakes. Eleanor's lips parted into the kind of smile that happens when you're not trying to smile, when your body simply responds to truth. Pages fluttered beside her as the wind picked up. The Vermont hills stretched out before her porch, like an unwritten novel, each tree a sentence, each patch of wildflowers a whispered footnote. Children's laughter echoed faintly in the distance, the Saturday reading club playing by the stream below. But Eleanor remained seated still, like the center of something vast and gentle. I know you probably won't say it, Milo's voice added in the recording, but I will. You saved me. And I think you saved yourself too. She reached out and turned the tape player off with a soft click, letting the silence settle like dust in a sunbeam. Her gaze lifted to the horizon, not wistful, not mournful. Just open. A page turned in her lap, not by her hand, by the breeze. She let it. The wind tousled her hair, pulled at her sleeves, carried with it the scent of pine and dried ink. She closed her eyes for a long moment, then opened them again, sharper, now present. The camera pulled back, revealing the porch in full. The bookstore just behind her, the hills, the sky split by 1,000 streaks of gold. And on the screen, in simple white serif font, the words emerged. Family is not always who we are born from, but who refuses to let us be erased. Another line followed. Eleanor didn't lose her family. She chose her truth. One final breath of wind. The pages in her lap lifted again, this time several at once, catching the breeze, fluttering out like small birds into the light. She didn't chase them. She just watched and smiled. The screen faded slowly to black. Then a final sound. Soft, mechanical, familiar. The whir of a film projector, its reel clicking in rhythm like a heartbeat made of memory. Click, click, click. Then silence. And finally the credits began to roll.